Convincing a dismissive requires a miracle, and I'm not a miracle worker. If humans didn't emit greenhouse gases, the Earth wouldn't be warming, but cooling. Caring about the climate can be based on Christian values. Those are some of the main points made by Katharine Hayhoe, who lectures on climate change in the predominantly Republican state of Texas. How can we speak about climate change in a way that connects rather than alienates? What's a better way to communicate than an argument? And why do some people dismiss science in the first place? These and other questions will be addressed in today's episode of Czech Radio's podcast Bedny with Katharine Hayhoe.
Bedny, a series of interviews with international experts and questions from young Czechs.
To fix climate change, we have to get off fossil fuels. There is no way around that. I often ask people, do you feel like the weather is getting weirder? And I have not had a single person say no. I truly think it takes a miracle to change a dismissive's mind. And I don't think I'm in the miracle business. Loss of food, loss of water, loss of homes, loss of education, sea level rise and coastal flooding, as if there's another planet you can go to if you destroy this one. There isn't. Fear is not enough to move us forward. Our brain is literally wired to move towards something that is better than what we have, not worse.
Katharine Hayhoe is one of the world's most renowned climate scientists. She is the chief scientist of the Nature Conservancy organization and combines insights from climate and political science in her work at Texas Tech University. Katharine often emphasizes that technology alone cannot combat the rising temperatures on our planet. Since human activities are the main cause of increasing emissions, it is our human stances on climate change that determine whether and how we address this global issue. Katharine's book, Saving Us, received praise from outlets such as Scientific American, The Guardian, and The New York Times. Having appeared on Jimmy Kimmel Live and delivered hundreds of lectures and talks, she is a household name among both political and climate scientists worldwide. How is it possible that so many of us still do not believe what 99.9% of scientific studies on climate change agree upon? How can we connect with those who seem unconvinced? And how do scientists really know why the Earth is warming? I'm very pleased to be speaking with Katharine Hayhoe today about how finding common ground with those we disagree with may help us preserve the living conditions on our planet that have enabled us humans to thrive for millennia. Katharine, it is my pleasure to welcome you to Czech Radio.
Thank you for having me.
Katharine, let's start with a fictitious scenario. I hope you don't mind that. Let's say our listener is at a family dinner and suddenly the discussion turns to politics. There's a conservatively minded uncle who tells them that climate change is an issue promoted by the progressive left to control everyone. What's the best way to engage with such a person?
That is a great question, and it is one that often occurs where I live in Texas. It often happens in Canada, where I'm from, and I have run into people who have the same question in almost any country around the world. So my answer begins with something that you said in the question, which is you clearly drew the connection between someone whose political beliefs cause them to reject science. And that's where we have to start, because it is not any lack of intelligence. It's not lack of education. It's not even lack of science knowledge that is causing people to reject this. It's their political ideology that is telling them it's not true. And the reason why it's telling them that is because of what scientists call solution aversion. So to fix climate change, we have to get off fossil fuels. There is no way around that. But the fossil fuel industry is very wealthy and very well connected with politics and have spent 30 plus years convincing politicians that it's in their best interest to maintain the fossil fuel industry as long as possible. And so today, studies have shown that around the world, people who are more conservative tend to be more doubtful that climate change is real or serious, and tend to be less supportive of climate solutions, not because they aren't impacted, but because they think the solutions pose a greater threat than the reality of the problem. And so arguing over the reality of the problem is not going to fix it, because that's not the problem. The problem is they don't think there's solutions that will fix it. So if the uncle brings this up at dinner, and I have an uncle and he has done that, number one, do not argue with them, because if you argue with them, that's actually what they're looking for. They brought it up because they want an argument, because arguing actually reinforces their pre-existing opinions or beliefs. It makes them feel even more convinced if they can argue about it. So it's almost like a trap. Like you're walking through the forest and there's some leaves and twigs on the ground, but you know there's a hole underneath. Don't step in that place because you will be going down.
Is there any way to have a conversation in a situation like that?
Possibly, but not by arguing. So if someone really wants to argue with me, my answer is, I'm sorry you're wrong. And how about, and then I ask them about something they like their family or their hobby or how's their job going or something like that. So I do not argue, just deflect. But if we do want to have a positive, constructive conversation, I often ask people, do you feel like the weather is getting weirder? And I have not had a single person say no. In fact, I had a conversation on a train from Berlin to Prague. I was sitting beside a Czech engineer. He asked me what I did. I said, I study climate change. He said, well, are you sure that that's really a serious problem? And I said, do you feel like the weather's gotten weirder? And he said, oh, yes. And he started to explain to me all the ways that the weather had gotten weirder in the Czech Republic. Mm-hmm. So then I said, well, this is exactly what I'm talking about. All of these problems that are being caused by what you just described, not me. Mm-hmm. And then he said, and this is exactly the right place to go. He said, well, what are we supposed to do about it? Because I'm conservative. And then that's our opportunity to talk about solutions that people who are conservative can get on board with, solutions that save us money, grow the local economy, give us better energy stability, make us more independent, not less. But we have to be aware of what solutions those are to bring them into the conversation.
Before we jump to the solutions, I would like to stay with the communication side of things for a bit more. If I understand you correctly, it's always good to start with something that we have in common with the person who disagrees with us. But what if, as a young Czech astronomer, Tomáš wants to ask you, we're dealing with someone for whom not trusting institutions or scientists is just part of their identity. I believe that in your book, you call such people dismissives. If we are indeed dealing with a dismissive, is there really no point in trying to convince them?
So often we think of people as just falling into two groups. We think there's believers and deniers. You know, people who say, yes, all the science is true, or people who say, no, the science isn't true. But in reality, research by the Yale Program for Climate Change Communication has showed that people fall into 6 groups. And you referred to that. So of the 6 groups, we have people who are alarmed and concerned. Then we have people who are cautious. And the cautious group is interesting because they often lead with their doubts, but not in an aggressive, argumentative way, more like, hey, how do you know? Like, I want to know. Then there's a tiny group who are disengaged, tiny, and getting smaller every year. And then there's a group that is doubtful and a group that's dismissive. And the doubtful and dismissive groups in the US, it's probably the biggest. They're only about 10% each. In other countries, we still have doubtful and dismissive, but they're much smaller. They might be 2 or 3%. Now, they are much louder. They talk about it all the time. They post about it all the time. They try to pick arguments all the time. But they're only a tiny fraction of the population. So often we think that it's our job to convince that tiny fraction. And it's not. We don't need that tiny fraction. And that's good news because, as you alluded to in the question from Tomáš, I truly think it takes a miracle to change a dismissive's mind. And I don't think I'm in the miracle business. I'm not a miracle worker. And I don't think you are either. I don't think Tomáš is either. But the good news is that person, we can just say, I'm sorry, you're wrong. Now let's talk about something else. And you could say, hey, how's the weather? Is it getting weirder? But most of the other people, the majority of people in almost every country, including the Czech Republic, including the UK, including Canada and the US and most other countries around the world, well over 60% of people are worried. Well over. In many countries, it's over 70 or 80% of people are worried. Here's the thing, though. They're worried, but they don't know what to do. So we do nothing. We don't talk about it. We don't think our friends and our neighbors and our colleagues care. So we do nothing. So what's the biggest thing that you and I and Tomáš and everybody else should do? focus on moving the people who are already worried but who don't know what to do into the activated category. And that's a very different thing to do than arguing with our uncle or our neighbor or our colleague over whether it's real. I don't think we will convince them, but we don't have to. All we have to do is take all these people who are already worried and don't know what to do and help them figure out how they can use their voice to call for action too.
And what activity is that? Is that voting for parties that recognize climate change as an issue? Or is what you have in mind just everyday conversation with anyone, regardless of their background or beliefs? Do you think, as another young Czech, Anna, wants to ask you, that it is at all possible for climate change to be seen as a serious topic across the whole political spectrum, considering that compared to joint efforts, individual actions might have a limited impact?
As Bill McKibben says, Bill McKibben is an author who's written a lot of really good books about climate change, sustainability, and more. He said the most important thing an individual can do right now is not be such an individual. And by that, he meant that when we work together with others, we can accomplish so much more. So often when we think about climate action, we focus on our personal choices. And if we live in a high-income country, then our personal choices matter a lot more than if we live in a low-income country. So I'm thinking of what we eat, how we travel, where we get our energy, what things we do or we don't buy, even where we keep our money, because obviously where we keep our money in a bank, do they use that money to invest in fossil fuels or not? If we live in a democratic society, voting is extremely important, and working with elected officials. So often at the level of a city or a region, you can accomplish so much more faster than at the level of a country. All of those things are really important. And as you alluded to actually in your first question, we can't do this by ourselves. We can't do it alone, but we can do it together. And so the most important place for each of us to start is, I think of it as the intersection of what needs to be done, huge circle, what I'm good at, makes it smaller, and then what opportunities I have right now that I actually feel like I can make a meaningful difference, that give me joy. So for example, I am a Christian, and so I often talk to churches, including in Scotland. I've actually worked with a really good program called Tear Fund based in Glasgow. And we created videos for why Christians should care about climate change. And they have been watched by over 150 churches in Scotland. So that's an example of something that I can do. But for example, I don't work in other areas. I don't have interests in fashion is not really one of my areas of interest, but I know other people who fashion is definitely their area of interest. And so they are very into how do we reduce the carbon footprint of not only our personal choices, but of organizations and companies in the fashion industry, for example. Other colleagues are athletes. And so they are working on how to speak to other athletes and how athletes can make a difference. So again, we can't do this alone. We can do it together. And the place for each of us to start is where we have the most connections. Because each of us, we have different interests, we have different expertise, we have different life experiences, and we can do something unique that nobody else can do. And so that's, I think, what each of us can do that makes the biggest impact.
Let's go back to that dinner with the uncle. Let's say that he's willing to listen and says, okay, there's some greenhouse effect. Perhaps he likes to grow tomatoes under a Scottish greenhouse and sees that our atmosphere is a bit like that. Maybe you've shown him the hockey stick graph of the temperature increase in the last 50 years. Still, he doesn't understand two things. First, how can we precisely know what the Earth's temperature was thousands of years ago? And second, how can we be so sure that the current rising concentrations is solely due to humans and not solar activity or volcanoes, as some people claim?
Sure. So first of all, with the uncle, if this uncle is truly dismissive and not doubtful or cautious, then really, I would just say, I'm sorry, you're wrong. Now let's talk about something else. If they were doubtful or cautious, though, I wouldn't tell them about how the weather is getting weirder. I would ask them. I would ask them to tell me what they had noticed and how it affected them. Because having somebody validate what you believe, your lived experience, is so much more powerful than somebody else telling you. So then if they told me all of that and I said, yes, that's exactly what I'm talking about, typically at that point, they actually do say, well, what are we supposed to do about it? Because remember, all of the it's not real, it's not humans, it's not bad, those are just excuses for the real problem, which is I don't want to fix it. Mm-hmm. So we have to understand that there's 5 flavors of climate denial. It's not real. It's not human caused. It's not bad. We can't fix it. It's too expensive. Or what about China? Or, and then the last one is it's too late. We can't do anything anyways. So all of those are just excuses. So when we engage with those directly, we're not actually addressing the real issue, which is, I don't want to fix it. Mm-hmm. So I would probably be talking about solutions by then with the uncle. But if they circled back around and said, okay, well, how do you know that this is so unusual? I would say, yes, it has been warmer before, but never with 8 billion people on the planet. Mm-hmm. We know from natural thermometers like ice cores and pollen records and sediment records that the Earth goes through periods of warmer and cooler and warmer and cooler. But we know that what's happening today is, first of all, happening so much faster than any time as far back as we can go in the history of the Earth. 55 million years ago was the last big warming period, and it was happening about 10 times slower than today. And irregardless, we didn't have 8 billion people on the planet. So often we talk about saving the planet, and I say it's not about saving the planet. The planet will be orbiting the sun long after we're gone. It's about saving, well, this is the title of my book. It's about saving us, us humans, and all the life on which our own life depends. We can't live without nature. The air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, it all comes from nature. So it's not about saving the planet. It's about saving us. And we, 8 billion people, have never seen it this warm before. And we've never seen it change this fast. So that's why this matters relative to the past. And then people say, well, how much of the warming is human? And this is actually an interesting question because many people who are alarmed and concerned, they don't get this question right. I've asked people who are alarmed and concerned, how much do you think is human? And people say, well, maybe 60%, maybe 2/3, maybe most of it. And they're very surprised when I tell them it's more than 100%. I say, how could that be? How could it be more than 100%? It's because when we see climate changing, we don't automatically assume it's humans. We first look at all the other natural causes. And we know that the sun's energy has actually been going down the last 50 years, not up. So according to changes in solar radiation, we should actually be getting a little cooler right now, not warmer. Then we look at natural cycles like El Nino and La Nina. They just move heat around the climate system. They don't cause the whole planet to warm. If anything, we just lose a little bit of heat during an El Nino because a bit of heat escapes out the top of the atmosphere. Then what about volcanoes? Volcanic eruptions just cool the Earth temporarily for maybe a few months up to maybe a year or two. And all of the emissions of heat-trapping gases from geologic activity, they're equivalent to maybe 3 mid-sized U.S. states in terms of their emissions. And then lastly, we have these orbital cycles that were discovered by Milankovic back 100 years ago that are changes in the shape of the Earth's orbit around the sun. It gets more circular and more elliptical. We also know that the tilt of the Earth's axis precesses changing the angle at which sunlight falls on the Earth. And we know that that is what drives what we call the ice ages or the glacial maxima, and then the warm periods in between like we're in right now. So then people say, well, aren't we just getting warmer after the last ice age? No, actually, warming peaked about 6,000 to 8,000 years ago. And then the planet was very, very slowly, gradually cooling, getting ready to head into another glacial maximum in about 1,500 years until the start of the Industrial Revolution. So I say, no, according to natural factors, we should be getting cooler right now. And instead, we're getting warmer faster and faster. That's how we know it truly is us.
Bedny on Czech Radio.
Is there another method beyond this process of elimination that would show that the cause of all the emitted greenhouse gases are humans and fossil fuels that we're burning?
Oh, yes, there definitely is. So the isotopic signature of carbon that has been hidden away from the atmosphere for millions of years is very different than the isotopic signature of carbon that's been cycling through the biosphere on a pretty rapid timescale of years to decades. So when we dig up carbon from deep underground in the form of coal, gas, and oil, and we burn it, then that carbon that gets released to the atmosphere has a different signature, and we can actually measure how the signature of the carbon that's been rapidly cycling through the biosphere versus the carbon that just got dug up and burned, how that proportion is changing. And that tells us how much of the carbon is coming from fossil fuels versus from other land use sources, because fossil fuels are responsible for about 3/4 of the problem. Deforestation, unsustainable agricultural practices, large-scale livestock cultivation, waste, the decay of organic waste, that's all responsible for additional heat-trapping gas emissions. But all of that happens pretty rapidly in the order of years to decades, whereas the fossil fuels, they're very clear. The thumbprint, so to speak, the fingerprint of fossil fuels in the atmosphere is very clear. There's no doubt where they're coming from and what they're doing.
Isotopes are atoms of the same element, but with a differing number of neutrons in the nucleus, just like carbon-13 and carbon-14. Apart from neutrons, the nucleus also has protons, which determine what element a given atom is. Are there any other markers that would tell us what temperature there was on Earth in the past? Does another isotope do that?
It does, but not carbon. We actually use an oxygen isotope in ice cores to measure as a proxy for temperature in the past. So ice cores are fascinating because basically when snow falls, it compacts the snow underneath. And as it compacts, these little air bubbles get sealed. And inside those air bubbles is a record of what was in the atmosphere at the time when it got sealed off from contact with the atmosphere. So it's amazing. It's like millions of little time capsules that you can analyze. And you can look at the levels of carbon dioxide, methane. You can look at the dust levels so we can track Sahara dust storms and volcanic eruptions. And we can look at the oxygen isotope that acts as a proxy for temperature. So there's a lot of inorganic chemistry and even some organic chemistry that's involved in measuring, monitoring natural thermometers and what they say about the Earth's history. But no matter what source we're using, some people even use historical documents. Some people use ice cores. Some use sediment records from the ocean. Some use pollen records from lakes. Tree rings are also a source of past information. But whatever source we use, we know without a shadow of a doubt that climate is changing extremely rapidly and humans have never seen these warm conditions before. And what's happening is it's putting us all at risk. The message is very clear. The further we look into the past, the more worried we are about what's happening today.
According to the World Meteorological Organization, the past 11 years have been the hottest on record. In 2024, global average temperature increase exceeded 1.5 degrees Celsius, a milestone that the Paris Agreement seeks to avoid. The Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research often mentions planetary boundaries and so-called tipping points. Can you explain what these tipping points are and where we currently are in terms of reaching them?
So as scientists, we know that, and literally this is from the IPCC report, every bit of warming matters. As scientists, we know that there's no magic number, that if we just get up to just that number, like 1.5, and we don't go over, we'll be okay. We haven't hit 1.5 yet. The 1.5 in the Paris Agreement is a climate target. So that means that we have to sustain an average of 1.5 or above for at least a decade, and we haven't done that yet. Temperature goes up and down from year to year, but it goes steadily upwards. And we will meet that pretty soon. But even 1.5 degrees is not a magic number because many people are already experiencing very severe and damaging climate impacts right now. If we look at the number of severe and damaging weather events that's happening, that's causing loss of food, loss of water, loss of homes, loss of education, even loss of life. If we look at sea level rise and coastal flooding, if we look at shifting rainfall patterns and drought, if we look at wildfire and wildfire smoke, all of that's already happening. And we're not even at 1.5 degrees. So what is that threshold about? 10 years ago, the world came together, informed by a lot of scientific research, of which I had been part of for over 10 years, where what we did as scientists was we documented, as the world gets warmer, how is that going to affect food, water, infrastructure, health, the economy, and more. But as scientists, we can't draw the line of what's considered dangerous because we see dangers at any point in the change. The dangers increase over time. Yes, they increase with the levels of warming. Absolutely. Some of them increase linearly, some increase exponentially, and some increase nonlinear. And that's where we get to tipping points. But the world came together 10 years ago and they had to make a decision. What would be considered dangerous at a widespread level? And so that's where the 1.5 and the 2 degree targets came from. Paris actually has 2 targets. Originally, they were aiming for 2 degrees, and they said 1.5 if we can. And that's aimed at preventing widespread dangerous interference with the climate system. But it doesn't mean that if we stay below, we're okay. We're already below today and we're not okay. And also, it doesn't mean, and this is really important, that if we pass that threshold, that it's all over. What it means is 1.6 is better than 1.7. 1.7 is better than 1.8. 1.8 is better than 1.9. And because of all the changes that have happened in the last 10 years, we used to be heading towards 4 to 5 degrees C of warming by the end of the century. Now we're heading to 2.7 to 3.2 degrees of warming by the end of the century. That's a big difference in 10 years. It's still not enough to prevent dangerous interference, but it's preventing a significant amount of impacts that would have occurred otherwise.
So when do the tipping points come in?
Well, when we look at the past climate, when we look at paleoclimate, we know that there have been abrupt changes in the climate system before, where part of the climate system enters a new state, like the Amazon transitions from forest to grassland, or the Arctic is ice-free every summer, or ocean circulation slows down or sometimes even stops. And this has massive impact on temperature and rainfall patterns around the world. But here's the challenge. We've never seen these exact initial conditions before with this exact magnitude of change happening so much so quickly before. Mm-hmm. So we don't know exactly when these physical tipping points in the climate system will be triggered. But what we do know is the faster climate changes and the more climate changes, the greater the risks, right? Mm-hmm. It's the same as smoking. There's no magic number of cigarettes that if you smoke 10,000 cigarettes, you will definitely get lung cancer. But if you smoke 9,999, you will not get lung cancer. That's not true. All we know is the more you smoke, the greater the risk. Well, that's the same with tipping points. A tipping point is like getting cancer, like you cross from being cancer-free to actually having cancer. So in the same way, we know that our climate system could cross a threshold from having a thriving ecosystem to not having it, to having ice at our poles to not having it. And that would have huge impacts on, again, our food, our water, our economy, people, and more. What we also are learning about recently, though, is that there are also social tipping points. There's tipping points in society where if enough happens to trigger that tipping point, societal change can happen just as fast. And we know that that's happened in the past with major civil issues, like the end of apartheid in South Africa, the abolition of slavery in the UK, women getting the vote, civil rights in the US. I think of social change like a dam. So there's a dam and there's all this pressure building up. As we work to build up that pressure, we think it's not changing. Nothing's changing. The dam is not changing. Nothing's changing. We get very discouraged. And then all of a sudden, the dam weakens and breaks. That's the way social change also happens too. And so there's growing research into how can we as individuals contribute to building up the pressure required to trigger social tipping points, which is what we want, because the faster we trigger those, the more we're able to mitigate the risk of the physical tipping points.
That's fascinating. You mentioned how serious of an issue climate change is. You talked about extreme weather events, including the increasing frequency of strong hurricanes. In Saving Us, you write that air pollution from burning fossil fuels is responsible for nearly 9 million premature deaths per year. And that's several years ago, so the current numbers might be higher. And so we have established that emitting large quantities of fossil fuels causes serious risks. Perhaps understandably, we've heard protesters like Greta Thunberg say, "I want you to panic." Yet, in your book, you go into existing psychological insights about fear and creativity, which makes you advocate for a slightly different approach. Can you tell me more about that?
Yes. So if we think that most people don't care and aren't worried, then the first thing we think we have to do is we have to make them worried. And that's not wrong. Why would we want to fix a problem if we're not worried? Right? So if most people don't care and are not worried, then we do need to make them worried. But that's only step one. Because if people are worried and they don't know what to do, they'll do nothing. In fact, if people are worried and they don't know what to do and they get more worried and more worried, they will actually become more paralyzed and our defense mechanisms kick in and they will dissociate from the issue. So for a long time, people assumed that most people didn't care and weren't worried because we didn't have data. And we just knew that most people around us weren't talking about it, which is true. Most people are still not talking about this issue. And we assumed they weren't talking about it because they didn't care and they weren't worried. Mm-hmm. But now there is global data. There's data for every country around the world. And that data shows that in most countries, most people are worried, but they don't know what to do about it. Most people think all they can do is recycle, which is not even a climate solution. And most people think nobody else cares. So they don't want to talk about it. So this is where data is so important. Because what that data shows us is, in fact, we were wrong. Most people are worried. Most people do think it's a serious risk, but they don't know what to do about it. And so if you make people who are worried more worried, they will just dissociate. And you know what? I have already seen this happening in Canada. So in Canada, 5-10 years ago, about 3/4 of people in the country were worried about climate change. Somewhere between 75 to 80% were worried. And then 2.5 years ago, we had the worst wildfire season we have ever had. I mean, when I was a child, I can't remember a single year when the sky turned orange. Not once. Not even one day. In 2023, the sky was orange across so much of Canada and even parts of the United States, with wildfires burning from coast to coast. Canada is the second biggest country in the world. And usually we have wildfires, out west or up north. They were on the Pacific coast, they were on the Atlantic coast, and they were everywhere in between. It was an unbelievable amount of wildfire, and it had a huge impact on people's health. Communities were evacuated. Insurance costs went through the roof. The damages were incredible. So if you thought that most people weren't worried, then you would think the wildfires would make them more worried. And when we had an election the next year, which we did, you would think more people would be voting for the candidates with the strongest climate plan. You would think. But I did not think that was what was going to happen, and I was right. So what I suspected was that most Canadians were already worried. But then when these massive wildfires happen, we think, what can I do? I drive an EV. I've been recycling. I try a new plant-based recipe every week. I signed up for a clean energy power plan. And that makes no difference. It makes no difference. So I feel like if it makes no difference, why am I even doing this? Why am I doing this? Why am I voting for a government who I don't think they made a difference either? Because the government didn't talk about what they were doing. They did make a difference, but they didn't talk about it either. So why would I vote for a government who isn't going to make a difference? Why am I doing all these things that won't make a difference? Forget about it. And so that's exactly what happened. Public opinions about climate change and willingness to vote for a candidate with a good climate plan went down after the wildfires, not up. Because people didn't think that the government could do anything and they didn't think they could do anything. So what's needed? Not more worry. More worry will actually make the problem worse. What's needed is understanding that you can make a difference, your city can make a difference, your business can make a difference, your school can make a difference, and your government can make a difference. And that communication is not happening.
Bedny on Radio Wave.
How does educating women around the world help us deal with climate change? Could you explain that?
Absolutely. So one of my favorite resources is called Project Drawdown. And Project Drawdown lists all the different types of solutions there are, because there's no one perfect solution. But there are many, there's dozens of solutions. And maybe for one place, for one situation, these 3 solutions are best. For a different place in a different situation, these other 4 solutions are best. It doesn't matter which solution. What matters is that we do what has the biggest impact for where we are and for what makes a difference. So how could female education be a climate solution? Well, it turns out that in low-income countries, the more education a woman has, the more food she's able to grow Typically, women are the ones who actually grow the food. They're the ones who cope with disasters when disasters happening. And the more education a woman has, the less chance there are of her children dying in infancy and of her having the ability to choose how many children she has. So the places where people have a dozen children, 7 or 8 of them die before the age of 5. And she does not have the education to invest in figuring out how to grow food, get the bank loans that she might need to do so, figure out the technology that people are increasingly putting on their phones to explain what to plant when and all that. Educating women is a huge climate solution, both for resilience and for mitigation. And I love that because who wouldn't want to empower women to enable them to choose how many children they have, ensure that their children grow up, be able to grow food for their children and provide for their children. And that actually helps to make people more climate resilient and to reduce emissions long-term as well.
It almost sounds as if educating women was a humane and beneficial alternative to forceful population control policies. When it comes to macroscopic solutions, people often talk about emissions trading, carbon tax, and different types of low-carbon energy sources or negative emissions technologies. Despite knowing these strategies quite well, annual global climate conferences don't really lead to states actually fulfilling the goals they set for themselves. Why is that the case? Are we missing a key policy?
Ooh, that's a great question. If I were in charge of the world, what would I change? First of all, I think it's important to emphasize that progress is being made. And often we don't think it's being made because nobody talks about it. So this is why I have a weekly newsletter called Talking Climate. And every week in the weekly newsletter, I talk about the progress we're making and what we can do as individuals to make a difference. So we have already reduced the projected temperature change by end of century from 4 to 5 degrees C to 2.7 to 3.2 degrees C. Again, that's not enough, but it's a big step in the right direction. What is preventing us from moving further? There's a few different things. First of all, our entire economy is built on the concept of a flat Earth. Why? Because we assume that all of our resources are infinite. We assume there's infinite resources to come into our economy. We don't value anything unless it's dug up or dead. Then we have put no value on the waste products we produce. Pollution, heat trapping gases, straight up garbage. We don't put any value on that. And that's because we assume that it can go far away where it doesn't bother us anymore. Well, both of those assumptions, they're only true on a flat, infinite planet. And we don't live on a flat, infinite planet. We live on a round, finite planet with 8 billion people. So our entire economic paradigm is incentivized against climate action. And that's why the work of people like Kate Raworth, who work on donut economics, and people who work on circular economies, whether it's developing a circular economy in the fashion industry or whether it's like the city of Basel in Switzerland that's actually trying to build a circular economy in their city. That's why circular economy efforts are so important, because they're actually trying to correct our faulty economic perspective for the reality that we live on a round, finite planet with 8 billion people. Digging down one level deeper, though, in addition to the fact that our economy is built on a false assumption, fossil fuels are massively subsidized. And after COVID, when fossil fuel prices went up, fossil fuel subsidies went up, and those companies made record profits. So their profits are increasing. They're not even decreasing. And this is a market distortion that carbon pricing is intended to correct. But unfortunately, efforts to implement carbon pricing, although there's many different industries, sectors, and countries around the world that have a price on carbon, there isn't really a unified global effort, or even not that many unified national efforts now that Canada's taken its price off carbon. There is some, and the EU has a price on carbon in some sectors, but it isn't implemented at the scale that would be needed to bring the emissions down. Then we have the fact that climate change is so politically polarized. As if there's another planet you can go to if you destroy this one. There isn't. If you think there is, just go watch the movie The Martian. And that'll show you how much work is involved in just one person surviving on that very different planet. So there's a lot of different barriers in the way. But one of the biggest barriers that I haven't mentioned yet is a lack of imagination of how much better the future could look. Most of what's motivating us is fear of avoiding bad consequences. And while that's very accurate, Neuroscientists tell us fear is not enough to move us forward long term. To move forward long term, our brain is literally wired to move forward towards something that is better than what we have, not worse. And we have failed to provide a vision of a world that is so much better than what we have today that anyone would want to get there. And if we say, well, here's what we need to do to get there, they'd be like, oh, okay, now I understand why we have to do this because we're going to this better place. We don't have that. We just have apocalyptic visions to avoid. We do not have that better future to head towards. And I feel like that is a fundamental issue that brings in and recognizes the expertise of artists, of people who are creative, of people who can paint those pictures, whether they do so literally with paint or with words or with movies or with art or in a dozen different ways. And so there's no one barrier, but that means there's no one solution. And we need so many different people, from economists to artists, to engineers, to inventors, to politicians, to policy experts. We need all of those people working on crafting that better future and painting a picture of what it looks like so people understand that solutions are possible.
You're a Christian. In the book, you say that white evangelicals are less likely to be worried about climate change. What Christian values make you believe that climate change is a serious issue? And do you think that these values are something that people generally share?
That's a great question. So outside the US, the majority of Christians do share these core theological values that humans have been given responsibility over every living thing on earth, which includes our sisters and our brothers, as well as all of nature, that we are to care for it, that we are to love each other and care for each other and be recognized by our love for others. And those are really the only core values we need. But in the United States, for many years, decades, and even centuries, politics and religion has been increasingly conflated, to where now in the US, many people, their statement of faith is written first by their politics and only second by their theology. And if the two come into conflict, they will go with politics over theology any day. And we see this in the US very clearly, for example, in the Catholic community. So Pope Leo, Pope Francis, Pope Benedict, and Pope John Paul, they all spoke out about the need for climate action, sustainability, about the impact on the poor, about injustice. So you would think if you're Catholic, obviously you would care about these things. Well, in the US, Hispanic Catholics care a lot about these issues. White Catholics do not. What's the difference? The difference is not being Catholic. The difference is their politics. And politics have to do with race. They have to do with socioeconomic status. They have to do with a whole host of things that have nothing at all to do with faith and religion. So last year, I actually got to address the World Evangelical Alliance at something called the Lausanne Congress. It only happens once every 15 years. 10,000 evangelical leaders from around the whole world get together to talk about issues that matter to Christians. And they asked me to give a plenary talk to 10,000 leaders on how what the Christian faith says directly informs our action for people, pollution, climate, and the planet. And there were other speakers who talked about justice. They talked about the Palestinian conflict, all kinds of different issues that our faith says something about. But it's not just the Christian faith. There are leaders in the Muslim faith, the Hindu faith, the Buddhist faith, the Jewish faith, leaders from all different world religions who make a direct connection between the values of their faith and why caring about climate change and caring about people and nature matters. So often I think that we have failed to begin our conversations maybe with the values people already have, which in some cases come directly from their faith. In some cases, they might come from their culture, informed by their faith. In some cases, they might not. But beginning with the things people already care about is really the most important way to start the climate conversation. Not trying to make people care about the things I care about already, but rather figuring out what things they already care about and then making the connection between what they already care about and why that means they're the perfect person to advocate for climate action.
Maybe there are people who share this care with you and the religious leaders that you talked about. They're young, care about the planet, and are interested in climate change. They care even about people who will be here after us and those who live elsewhere in the world. They're listening to this episode thinking, I would also love to be able to speak about climate like this, have impact, inform people about science, but maybe they're not exactly studying degrees connected to climate change. Is that a problem? Or is it possible for anyone to follow your trajectory?
I think we need everyone. So if someone asked me, what should I study today? I want to make a difference on climate change. I wouldn't say climate science. I mean, unless you're passionate about climate science specifically, I would say study whatever it is that you're passionate about, that you love, and that you're good at, and then use your skills and your expertise to make a difference on climate change. Because every day I work with people who have degrees in marketing and communications. I work with people who have degrees in engineering and public policy. We need people who have degrees, like I talked about, in everything from health to fashion. We need architects. We need medical professionals. We need good lawyers. we need everybody. So whatever you're interested in, study what you are most passionate about, and then use the skills and the expertise you have to make a difference. We need everyone. And like I talked about, we definitely need artists and creatives as well.
What disciplines do you actually combine in your work? Did you ever think you'd go into atmospheric science and eventually direct your focus towards communication and outreach?
I never imagined. So I started off my career in astrophysics, and then I went on to graduate school in atmospheric physics, which is the specific application to our planet's atmosphere. Then I did some atmospheric chemistry, and then I got into high-resolution climate modeling, which means that I had to be good at coding also and data analysis. And then I actually moved from a geoscience department to a public policy department. And so now I actually teach on policy as well. And then with all the communication I do, I wanted to make sure I was doing it according to best practices. So I follow a lot of research on psychology, neuroscience, messaging, framing, persuasion. All of those things are so relevant to what I do, and I find them absolutely fascinating. And I've even done experiments where I've tested if we do this versus if we do that, how does that change people's opinions? So I never imagined when I started off back then where I'd be today. And I think that's another important lesson, that whatever you're studying today or whatever you're working on today, it might not be what you're working on in 10 years. Just stay flexible, follow your heart, and look for where you, with your unique abilities and talents and expertise, can make the biggest difference next. We don't need to have our whole life mapped out in front of us. We only need to know the next step. And the next step becomes much more clear when we have a very good understanding of who we are, what we enjoy doing, what we're good at, but we also understand what difference we want to make in the world.
Thank you very much for the interview.
Thank you for having me.
Bedny. Interviews with people who have something to say on Radio Wave. You can listen to Honza Žižka's series on wave.cz and other streaming platforms today.
Thank you for listening all the way to the end. Our next guest on the show will be Caelan Robertson, an independent journalist from Ireland who reports from the front lines of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, reaching millions of people around the world. How does someone find the courage to go and report from places where they might be hunted by killer drones? And why did Caelan decide to move to Ukraine for good? Stay tuned for the next episode. Thank you again, have a good day, and until next time.